We live in interesting times, and the issue of immigration is at the heart of our national conversation once again. We are happy to provide a forum for one piece of this important conversation, the response of municipal government and local police to keeping immigrant communities safe. We hope today for candid civil dialogue, for looking for ways to solve problems and generate ideas together, and to promote ongoing discussion and community engagement. With that, I turn it over to Professor Virgil Wiebe to introduce our guests and explain the format. Professor Wiebe is the co-director of the University of St. Thomas's Interprofessional Center for Counseling and Legal Services and the director of the law school's Immigration Clinic. Professor Wiebe.
So I'd like to thank in particular Professor Warren and the Community Justice Project for co-sponsoring this event, as well as the Terrence J. Murphy Institute for Catholic Thought, Law, and Public Policy for doing a great job in helping us organize, and for their financial support as well for lunch. This panel needs little introduction, so that's what they will get. Felipe Illescas, at my far right, is Director of Outreach and Public Policy Campaigns for the Service Employees International Union in the areas of immigration, education, and revenue. Felipe has been a public policy professional for the past 10 years and has done such work for the Immigrant Law Center of Minnesota and Pillsbury United Communities. He has a bachelor's degree in business administration and a master's in business management. Jacob Fry, to my immediate right, is the 48th mayor of Minneapolis and a former Minneapolis City Council member, and he's also a civil rights attorney by profession. Jacob grew up in Northern Virginia and went to the College of William and Mary and to law school at Villanova. He's an avid runner and fell in love with the Twin Cities after running in the marathon here. With respect to today's topic, he's pledged to defend new Americans from President Trump's ICE, to support pipelines to jobs for immigrant communities, and to promote culturally conscious city services. And also to my right is Chief Midoriya Arredondo, and he is the 53rd Chief of the Minneapolis Police Department, being named to that post last year. He joined the department in 1989 and has held numerous positions within the police department. He began as a patrol officer in the 4th Precinct and worked his way up through the ranks before being appointed to the inspector of the 1st Precinct in 2013. Of special note for our topic today, the chief has served as MPD's liaison for the National Initiative for Building Community Trust and Justice, overseeing the execution of initiatives on procedural justice, implicit bias, and reconciliation training. So the format for today will be as follows. I've asked each speaker to address the following issue in 6 minutes. From your perspective, what are the 2 problems and challenges to safety in immigrant communities, and what are 1 or 2 tangible, actionable ideas for improving safety in immigrant communities? Each speaker will then have 2 minutes to respond. Juan Wosen will be keeping time, and he has strict instructions to make very clear that we're at the end of particular time periods. Meanwhile, you in the audience will be able to jot down questions on cards. Juana and Sheila are circulating about with cards, and if you'd like one, you can just raise your hand and they'll bring a card to you. They'll come back and pick it up. I'll kind of sift through those questions. It's unlikely that we'll have time to answer all of them. For the attorneys seeking CLE credit, you can sign up here to my right after the event if you have not done so already. And I know that we have a few members of the press present. If you could ask, if I could ask them to refrain from submitting questions on cards, we may have some time afterwards to my left to have questions to the speakers. And order of speaking was determined by the drawing of lots, and for some reason it was the mayor, the chief, and Felipe. That's truly how it turned out by chance. So I'm going to turn it over right away to the mayor.
Well, good afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you for having me today, and thank you for the great honor that you've bestowed on me in naming the moot courtroom behind me after me. That was a joke. It has nothing to do with me at all, but a huge thank you to the Murphy Institute, to St. Thomas Law School, and to the Community Justice Project for all their work setting this up. It is greatly appreciated. And you know, I think back to my great aunt, who was an immigrant, escaped just prior to the Holocaust from Nazi Germany, and she told me that you always have to be keenly aware not just for yourself, but for others, family members, friends, people who you don't know at all in your community. And I think during these really difficult and concerning times, we all need to be keenly aware for one another. You know, we have this Donald Trump presidency, we have gridlock at the state and federal legislatures, and I think it's incumbent on municipalities, it's incumbent on all of us to make sure that we're looking out for one another. And just yesterday, I had the opportunity to head down to actually ICE, Immigration Services, just outside the city, to stand with Dr. Wanyama, who is a professor over at Augsburg University. Here's an individual who is a champion of community, who's been here for 25 years. He's a professor of English literature, mentored countless individuals. I mean, he is everything that we want in our city. He is emblematic of everything that we should want to aspire to be in our country, and they are trying to deport him right now. That is despicable. That's the kind of thing that we need to be pushing back on right now. And you know, this is not just the moral thing to do. It is the moral thing to do. It is the right thing to do. It's also both the financially expedient and the economically sound thing to do. In 2013 alone, our immigrant population contributed to $1.6 trillion in gross domestic product. $1.6 trillion. To give you an idea what that means, in the state of Minnesota as a whole, in 2013, it was about $312 billion. So about 5 or 6 times that is what the immigrant community contributed in 2013. We need our immigrant population here. They've been the CEOs, the entrepreneurs, the artists, the creative class. They've been the workers of our country for quite some time, and it is absolutely essential. And so what can we do? What can we do at the city level? Well, first off, you know, we have a separation ordinance in the city. You know, you may have heard about some of President Trump's executive orders that he's issued that say that, you know, we are going to deprive cities and local governments and states of any federal funds if they are sanctuary cities. You know, interestingly, there's no exceedingly clear definition of what constitutes a sanctuary city. You know, we might be one, we might not be one. We stand up 100% for our undocumented community, but it's unclear what the definition is. What we have is the separation ordinance, and what that says is that our police, our chief, our public officials are not to ask the question as to whether an individual is documented or not. And because we haven't asked the question, we haven't gathered any information. And because we haven't gathered any information, when Donald Trump goes and says, give us all your information or you're deprived of federal funds, our first response is quite simply, hey, we don't have any. You know, not to mention, and I say this because we're in a law school right now, I believe it's Chapter 8, Section 1373 of the United States Code, says very clearly that, and if you talk to any of the judges, both conservative and liberal, they'll all say that he can't do what she's trying to do right now. So we actually have the law on our side in a big way. And there's more that we could do with the city in addition to that. We're going to be offering immigrant services pro bono, legal services. And the law is very important right now because, as I said, in many instances it is on our side. Also, there's been a whole lot of distrust in public officials, distrust in the police, distrust in the city enterprise as a whole, and we need to be engaging and building out those relationships and creating the foundation to begin with so that we can offer the services and that we're trusted. Third, U-Visa certifications. Are people familiar with that, generally speaking? We need to make sure that those U-Visa certifications are expedited, which the city has an ordinance on, as well as that there's a rebuttable presumption of helpfulness. What these U-Visas mean is that an individual who could be helpful, and who is undocumented or otherwise in some form of criminal investigation, is not going to get deported. Reducing jail sentences for petty crimes so that those who are undocumented aren't getting on a list that would eventually prescribe their deportation. Also pre-charge diversion. There's a lot of instances where we don't need to charge to begin with. We can divert this individual from our criminal justice system so that they're able to very quickly reincorporate into the community and society and keep on working here in the country. And then a couple other things. One of them is Municipal ID. This is something that we're looking at right now as to how we can incorporate in our city. Right now in our city, there are individuals who are undocumented, who are working odd jobs, say landscaping. They make a whole bunch of money. At the end of the week, they get paid in cash because they can't open a bank account. They get the cash. They can't go into the bank to open the bank account, and so they become prime targets for mugging and robbery. And so what this Municipal ID would allow for is them to open up the bank account, become full and true members of our city, as we all know that they are. And these are some things that I think the city can be working on. But at the end of the day, it's going to take all of us. It's going to take elected officials. It's going to take nonprofit community members. It's going to take lawyers. If we're actually going to be keenly aware of the people that we all proclaim to protect and want in our city. And yes, we do want immigrants of all forms in our city. We've relied on them for hundreds of years. They are our family members, they are our community members, and they will continue to be. Thank you so much.
First, I just want to say, if my mic's on here.
It just fell off.
Oh, it just fell off.
It's right there in your hand. Yep.
Gotcha. Okay. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for having me here. Fear and distrust right now are probably the two biggest key pieces that, as Chief of Police, I'm concerned about as it relates specifically to our undocumented communities. With fear and distrust, myself and members of the police department, we are usually the most visible and first contact that our communities will have with government. If that fear and distrust is embedded within our community, then it absolutely makes us least effective in terms of providing them the public safety services that they all need and should have. I have to make sure that we are having policies in place, public safety policies in place, that look after all of our community members. When I go into looking at our policies for safety, I have to make sure that they're done in such a principled way that it provides respect and dignity to those that we are serving. As chief, I also want to make sure that our local, regional, and state and federal partners have public safety policies that don't alienate or disenfranchise our community members. It's very important. One thing that is certainly I have seen is that when we have rhetoric within our communities, local, state, and even national, that create a divisiveness between our community members, there are people in our communities that will prey upon that. If there are members in our community that look upon a certain segment of our population as being less valued or that they do not matter, they have more of a likelihood to be preyed upon and victimized. I can't allow that. And the last thing I want as a chief of police is for someone in our community to be a victim of a crime and then be secondarily victimized because they are too afraid to pick up the phone and call us when they need help. That's right. So I've been working very closely with Mayor Fry and our other elected officials to make sure that we have good, strong policies that look after and care for all of our community members. And in light of a lot of this rhetoric and divisiveness that is going on today, that we are making sure we're paying special attention so that all of our community members are being protected as they should be. I will continue to do that. One of the measures that I've also, we're going to implement very soon, matter of fact, I'm hoping by June of this year, and certainly with the mayor's support, is for the first time ever in our police department, we're going to bring on community navigators. It's important for me as chief to let the mayor know what we do really well as a police department, but it's also important for me to have honest conversations and say, Mayor, this is a space where we're not so good at responding to. I will tell you right now some of our focus points and discussions we have. For example, our Native communities are being hit very hard with heroin and opioid issues there. But our Latino and undocumented communities, the fear and distrust. when our members have to respond to them, there's a fear that they have the consequence of calling us will lead to loved ones being deported. Can't have that. And so there are spaces where I believe these community navigators will go in and serve as a conduit, serve as a safe and reassuring conduit to make sure that all of our communities are being served in a just and dignified way as they should be. The mayor mentioned municipal IDs. I think that's an important step as well. Other cities across the nation have, certainly police jurisdictions have done this. NYPD, for example, is doing that as well. And also dialogue. It means me as chief and other members within our rank and file going into spaces where our community, particularly undocumented communities, meet. Whether that's me showing up at Holy Rosary Church or Incarnation Church and listening to the concerns that our community members have, that's very important. And it's very important to help me make sure that I'm shaping public safety policies that will, again, serve in a very dignified and respectful manner where people can feel reassured that they can call us and we are allies and partners in their public safety. Thank you.
You don't have to stand, Felipe, if you don't want to.
Well, I feel compelled to. But I want to thank Professor Wiebe for the invitation and St. Thomas as well for being here today. So, and thank you all for coming. I guess one of the good things about going last is that I get to say that everything I was going to say has already been said, and I don't want to be repetitive. I mean, some of the issues, there are two things that are really impacting immigrant communities right now. It's obviously government, federal government mostly, and also state government. The trend that we've, from a public policy standpoint, one of the things that we've been sort of following and seeing is once the federal government acts, when they act a certain way, right now it's following an anti-immigrant trend, and then we have a particular party and power right now at the state, then they tend to follow suit, and whenever a bad policy passes or is being implemented at the federal government, then usually our state tries to follow, and that's it continues to affect immigrant communities in different ways. So I would say the government is a big issue right now. Sometimes it's working for immigrant communities, and most of the time it's working against. Another issue is intercultural training. And I don't mean in the sense of understanding races and our behaviors, and that's part of it definitely, but it's also understanding our challenges. And for example, when we talk about public safety, it's not necessarily around crime or ensuring that we're safe. That's part of it as well, but for immigrant communities, it's mostly around our welfare, and what that means is keeping families together. And when you have children whose parents are being deported, when you have husbands and wives whose partners are being deported and those families are being broken, the family suffers. And it's not just the family, but then also families connected to that family, neighbors and friends. So that's a big issue. And the mayor talked about making sure that people are not being deported for small crimes. Oh, is it not working? Yeah. All right. And so the mayor mentioned that ensuring that that families or individuals are not being deported for small crimes, that's a big issue in our community. Even though we have a separation ordinance in Minneapolis, we have the newly passed U visa certification, we still hear of cases where folks are being pulled over, turned over to county custody, and then once they're in the system, then they could go into deportation proceedings for small crimes. So that's something that we've been able to see an improvement within Minneapolis, and usually Minneapolis is always paving the road when it comes to pro-immigrant legislation and implementation of different policies, but there's always room to improve. And that's part of why I'm here today, and again, thank you all for being here. I look forward to the questions. In the interest of time, and again, because everything was already said, or a lot of what I wanted to say, I really, I'm looking forward to your questions, so thank you.
So I'm going to exercise the prerogative of the chair a little bit, and it actually goes along with one of the questions here. and that is maybe a process either intentionally or unintentionally that I might refer to as prosecution by deportation. And that could involve when Felipe was alluding to someone coming into the system as a result of a relatively minor or more serious offense, maybe a traffic offense or a DUI. They're booked in to the Hennepin County Jail after being arrested by perhaps the Minneapolis Police Department. And then ICE is made aware of their presence and may take them into custody before they've even been arraigned, after they're released from custody. So what happens then is that person may never get back in front of a judge to have their case heard. The prosecutor may never see them again. The prosecutor may not try to get them back from ICE custody, and what you have then is perhaps someone being deported, and not only is there the challenge of being able to come back to the United States after that, but if they have not appeared, not through any fault of their own, for a hearing, there's a bench warrant waiting for them. So this is sort of the complex interaction of policing, of prosecution, of federal custody, and of county policies. I mean, and how do you respond to that? Maybe we need some judges and the sheriff and prosecutors and ICE up here too, but maybe that's for another day. But if you have some responses to that sort of issue.
Yeah, so that's a very good question. I'm certainly charged with making sure that we're carrying out our public safety here for the city of Minneapolis, but many of you probably know that Minneapolis does not run its own booking facility or jail. That is a county purview. And so all of the policies that Mayor Frey has mentioned regarding separation ordinance, regarding our immigration when it comes to police matters involving immigration, those are working well for us, but I know that realistically, and being very genuine with everyone, once we transport that person to the Sally Port of Hennepin County Jail, a totally new system of rules and policies go into effect that I as chief have no control over. But I will tell you that there are impacts of that in terms of my efforts to make sure that our department's doing the best we can to build trusting relationships, because when I do go back out to, for example, Holy Rosary Church or Incarnation Church, and I see a mother weeping and very angry and very passionate, saying, "But Chief Rondo, you arrested my son, and now he's no longer in this country, and our family is separated and torn apart," we did play a role in that. We did play a role in that. I mean, we certainly made the arrest. We brought that person into custody, and we certainly might have obviously had the reason to do that, but there is a broader impact and a consequence to that impacts the trust that we're absolutely trying to build. And so, yeah, it is a very complex, and there's other stakeholders involved in this, but I do have conversations with the sheriff's office. He certainly is aware of the efforts I'm trying to do to build better relationships with our community, but we're in this together. As I mentioned in my remarks earlier, it's not just the Minneapolis Police Department. We all have to, I believe, we're obligated within public safety agencies to make sure that our policies are all aligned in a way that is continuing to make sure that we're providing public safety, but that we're also doing so in a very respectful and dignified manner.
So I'm going to throw a tough question right at you, Mayor Frey. Do you support an open border policy? Because if we are not following the current immigration laws on the books, what's the point of having any? Do you think the best way to fix immigration laws with executive action or legislative action? It's a compound question, but...
Say it one more time.
So we'll start with the first one. Do you support an open border policy? Because if we are not following the current immigration laws on the books, what's the point of having an immigration law?
Well, I think an open border policy is a bit of a misnomer. I mean, you still need to track. I support the DREAM Act. I support Dreamers continuing to be here. I support those who have immigrated not being deported. But you still need to track those who are coming in and coming out. One example is with the census. So with the, you may have heard with the recent census, they're actually adding an immigration question. They're adding a citizenship question as to whether you're here legally or not. And because they're adding that question, there is a high likelihood, in fact, there is a certainty that individuals that would have otherwise answered now won't, and thus won't be counted. And if they're not counted, by the way, that is a massive impact economically and financially to the state of Minnesota. I mean, we rely on monies coming from the federal government in the form of community development block grants, low-income tax credits, numerous different sources of funding that is based on the number of people and that you have in the city or that you have in the state. And in Minneapolis, for instance, we do have a large immigrant population that we love, that we want to stay. And if they're not counted, I think it dramatically impacts.
All right. So here's a question for anyone on the panel. So I'll let Felipe take a shot at it first. How can we focus on eliminating structural racism from our city, particularly within the police department?
Thank you, Virgil. Well, I think that, as I mentioned, training is a big issue, and I'm not saying that the department. I'm sure there's training within the department. However, I think that the training has to go a little deeper. Structural racism is something that's not going to go away because we attended a year worth of training. I think like you mentioned, it's structural, and so unless there are changes to the actual structure of the department, and we start seeing results, even though members of the department are going to training and we see that they're going to training, however, we continue to see, for example, officers of color being charged versus white officers not being charged. It's hard to believe that there's any change actually happening within the department. So I guess I would just encourage, the mayor and the chief to continue to seek out deeper trainings, continuing to involve the community, and to listen to the community, and partnering with residents and advocates and professionals. There are many professionals out there who understand the need, not just of understanding race and the intersection between cultures, but again, the challenges, and to really understand why, unless we have any change, we're really never going to get out of this cycle.
And maybe just to follow up on that, Chief, I know that part of this recent process that you've been a part of, that implicit bias training has been mandated for everyone in all the officers in the department, and that I think it's spreading out within the rest of the structure of the department as well. The recent study from the Minnesota Committee of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights found that implicit bias training, at least one of the findings was that it has a very big immediate impact, but that sort of erodes over time. Maybe you could share a little bit about that process and maybe sort of reflections on what are next steps for the department.
So implicit bias, we actually have launched what we call procedural justice training. And procedural justice, not only just training, but ensuring that, just so for those of you who don't know, procedural justice is really about the golden rule. It's making sure that we treat everyone by giving them voice, treating them with respect, having neutral engagements with them, and building trustworthy spaces. And by the way, that's not just with our community engagements, that's how we treat each other as colleagues as well. That has to be part of our DNA in everything we do. And it also helps with our health and wellness of officers. We know that we have folks in our community that have suffered from not only historical trauma, but current day trauma. But what we haven't done in the culture of policing is we haven't really named that trauma, how it impacts us as officers. And we have to make sure that we're keeping our officers healthy and well. So the first thing that I made sure that I did was the procedural justice and implicit bias training that we're doing, that it wasn't just a check the box. Because like many folks know that when people who are resistant to change, and I always make the comment that there's two things that police hate the most, and that's change and the way things are. So we have to make sure that, that they knew that it was going to be part of our culture, part of our DNA, that it wasn't going around, that we have a full-time, dedicated procedural justice team. And that's also our civilian team members is too. So whether it's the officers who are responding to the traumatic 911 call, or whether it's the community member that's coming downtown to City Hall trying to navigate to get a police report, all of us represent and are ambassadors to what's great about our city. We have to make sure that that's embedded throughout all parts of our department. The other thing I wanted to mention about the importance of not just the implicit bias training or structural racism, but it's one thing that certainly Mayor Fry has championed, and certainly now as chief, I wouldn't have thought I'd been championing this 5 years ago. But housing, basic shelter needs for individuals. We have that's a crisis right now, and we have to make sure that people have those basic necessities. That impacts public safety. When people do not have shelter or adequate mental health services or chemical health dependency services, that impacts our communities. And so we need to also have that conversation and make sure that we're championing those things as well. So we're trying to look at not only just from a public safety, but from a public health lens as well. And so that's some of the things that we're doing.
Great. So here's a question for the mayor. How does your plan to add a substantial increase in the number of officers to the police force support the goals that you have of wanting to make our immigrant communities feel safe and integrated into our communities? Are these new officers to be added strictly to the engagement activities that the chief mentioned?
Well, it's a good question. First, let me say, while I do support adding officers to the police department, there's not a specified number over a specified period of time. That goes to the budget conversations. But this is actually a really important topic because in Minneapolis, our police officers in the MPD are tied to a separation ordinance. Our officers are making sure to look out for immigrants. Our officers are making sure not to ask the question as to whether an individual is documented or not. Our officers have implicit bias training and procedural justice training and are making sure not to put them down the wrong path. Not to mention, our officers are also very cognizant of the fact that we have some form of pre-charge diversion and other aspects that would prevent these individuals from getting in a quick pipeline to be deported. That is not the case if we have to rely on officers from other jurisdictions. So it might not be immediately apparent, but if we have more authority, if we have more control in Minneapolis, then they're not being diverted through the wrong paths in other jurisdictions nearly as much.
So you're suggesting having more
If in Minneapolis we are not relying on other jurisdictions, in other words, we have enough officers to handle the situation without relying on other jurisdictions.
So can you explain, like, what are the situations in which the city is relying on other jurisdictions to police Minneapolis?
It happens all the time.
Okay. Maybe to give us some examples of that?
Transit PD, we got State Patrol, we have Hennepin County. Hennepin County is a sheriff. There's a number of different other jurisdictions that don't have the same protections that would be bestowed if it were handled through our Minneapolis Police Department.
But an increase in MPD officers won't reduce the number of sheriff's officers or transit police, will it?
It would represent the numbers that are required to patrol in Minneapolis to handle any given situation. So yes, it would.
Okay.
And just to echo the mayor's comments, right now, every year, we're averaging about 500,000 911 calls a year. We are really trying to make sure that we get more of our officers to break that cycle, to get them out of those squad cars and have these positive community engagements with our undocumented communities, with all communities. But if we don't have the right number to do that, we will be tied into that. And so the mayor also mentioned again too, we have a robust transit system, and nothing against our Metro Transit officers, but they have a large footprint in our city. Hennepin County Sheriff's deputies do as well. So there are other jurisdictions that don't necessarily fall under our same policies and guidelines.
That's right.
I was feeling a little bit bad about breaking my rule about not giving each of the panelists 2 minutes to respond earlier, but I think we have enough to talk about here for another hour and a half.
And I want to add a little bit. I want to add a little bit to this topic because it is an important one. We all claim to want better police-community relations. And to me, that means two things. That means accountability. And we're adding accountability measures. In fact, we added in one of the most robust body camera policies just a couple days ago in the entire country that adds accountability, that adds transparency, and that adds discipline. You know, no body camera policy is worth its salt unless there are consequences when you don't follow it. So we got to add the accountability. And we are. And you're going to see a number of other policies and recommendations that are coming forward in the very near future on that topic. But right now, when you have an officer, you get a call, regardless of where in the city it's from, you have a 911 call, and that officer is 45 minutes late to the first interaction, and then 50 minutes late to the second interaction, an hour late to the next interaction after that. Every single one of these engagements are bad. That's the cycle that we want to break. We want to change the perception of what the Minneapolis Police Department is and change the culture from within. And if every interaction is bad, then the public perception is poor. And if the public perception is poor, then when you go out and recruit and everybody thinks poorly of our Minneapolis Police Department, who's going to want to be on it? The people that you don't want to be on it. So I think, you know, it's a very easy thing to say, more accountability equals fewer cops. It's a very simplistic thing to say, but you got to look at the whole picture and how everything functions. Accountability, yes. Transparency, yes. Engagement, we need to give them the time.
So a question for the panel, and it's, I'll again let Felipe take the first crack here. Recognizing the fact that bad or criminal actors are preying on undocumented communities, do we have a moral obligation to stem the flow of undocumented immigrants, thereby reducing the potential targets for the criminal elements who are harming these communities?
Well, I think that we need to step up our efforts to go after these bad actors. Perhaps imposing, harsher punishments for, for example, folks that prey on undocumented immigrants, like the notarios. Basically decentivizing the practice. I think that in addition to that, we really need to start looking at more proactive, more proactive policies. And I guess I'm sort of going back to the previous question a little bit of adding more police, more officers to the department. I think that needs to be combined with, if that is the case, then if we continue to see folks being turned over to county, to the hands of the county, perhaps we can also start looking at how do we set up a system where the city is also contributing to the defense to the defense of these immigrants who end up in some sort of detention.
Yeah, I agree.
All right. Perhaps somewhat of a flip side to that question, do you think, this is directed to the chief, do you think criminal defendants should get a better deal on their criminal cases just because they're undocumented?
No.
Okay.
No. When people do harm to our communities, they have to be held accountable. And that's what I look at. Just as though I'm ensuring that our officers are not out there and engaging with our community members specifically and solely based upon their citizenship or whether they're documented or not. When people harm our communities, they harm our communities. I don't think it's, I don't think victims look at it being less harmful if I was burglarized by someone who was so.
So I'm going to make this a little bit more difficult with another one of the questions who's asking about, the question is asking about have there been efforts at the state level to allow undocumented individuals to have driver's licenses? And those of us who followed that issue, that has been an effort at different points in our history. It didn't matter what your immigration status was to have a driver's license. But what might happen now is the consequences of driving without a license may not just be a ticket from one of your officers, but it might be deportation. So should deportation be the punishment for driving without a license?
So full disclosure, I'm in full support of making sure that our undocumented community members have a form of a license to drive in our communities. there's a lot of public safety leaders that also agree with that. I don't want, you know, again, looking at it from not just a public safety lens, but a public health lens. We know that there are so many members of our community who are undocumented, who are going to work every day, who have to drop their children off at daycare, who are doing very productive and meaningful things. And if we can have folks where they're not feeling that I have to look over my shoulder every time I get into that car, or perhaps maybe it's potentially more likely to leave from the scene of an accident or something like that, I think that allowing undocumented community members to have a license, I think that would be helpful for certainly me as Chief of Police.
Maybe Felipe, and then I do have a question for the mayor.
Sure, no, I just want to take this opportunity to thank the Minneapolis for their leadership on this issue, actually. Throughout the years, we've seen the city of Minneapolis be very supportive on the issue of restoring access to a driver's license for undocumented drivers. I've seen them testify, and I've seen council members testify in front of committee at the legislature. You know, they've provided letters of support. So I just want to take this opportunity to say thank you.
Thank you.
So here at the law school, we put a big emphasis on not just the ground level policy, but also thinking about the bigger questions. And you've raised some of these, Mayor Fry. Who do you think should decide what is right or moral in an immigration case?
Oh. You know, I don't know. It's like a kind of a philosophical question that I think I'd need to philosophize about for maybe a day.
You can look over your shoulder for help from...
So who do I think should be making the decision as to what is right or moral in an immigration case?
Yeah.
You know, I would say the best result would be is if it is a benevolent, community-minded, progressive judge that has been appointed, you know, through the community process, and that is making sure not just to institute the law, but also to understand the ramifications on the community when we lose our family members and our friends to deportation. You know, I probably would have to think longer, maybe even a day, about who that particular individual might be and how they would, you know, handle things. You know, I've always, you know, RBG, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, is a hero of mine. So, you know, she certainly is probably the first person that comes to mind. But no, I don't have a good answer.
I'm not even going to touch that.
Yeah.
Felipe?
I would say let's move on to the next question.
Yeah.
Well, here's one for the chief. What can MPD do to reach out to victims of domestic violence? As an immigration attorney, many of my clients who've been abused fear calling MPD for help because they fear that their abuser could be deported. So it's both a need for safety, but also a concern for perhaps the parent of their children.
That's a great question, and I will say that domestic violence in our communities is still a very, very, it's a concerning and impactful issue, certainly for us within the police department. We've done several studies, a burn grant study, and I will actually say we did a Cedar Riverside project study a couple of years back that had some very compelling data that we showed. When we started that study in our outreach to the Cedar Riverside, particularly our East African communities, our domestic violence reported numbers were way down. By the time we ended that study and by the time we had that genuine and authentic engagement with our community, our East African community, we saw our domestic violence numbers go up. So there are some within my profession that would go, that's alarming, red flags and everything else. What we found out was because of those relationships, more victims were feeling comfortable and safe to call us and report those incidents of domestic abuse. So sometimes high numbers may give you one indicator, but it showed that we were absolutely making some thresholds into reaching our community members and particularly victims of those crimes, so that we were able to now start working with them, advocacy, and giving them, providing the services that they needed. We still need to do a lot more work on that as it relates to our undocumented communities because, again, if that fear and distrust is there, they're not going to call us. And I don't want our community members to be victimized twice, but at the same time I recognize that that is a real fear, that not only am I being, I could be in an abusive relationship, but by me speaking out, the person who I love, the person who may be the parent of our children, the person who may be providing the income for us to survive and live, could be no longer here. And so, again, in my conversations and with the support of the mayor, I know that there are spaces that we may not be the most appropriate ambassador. So we talked about community navigators. There are people who are really professional and have the experience and expertise to help us bridge that. I will just also say one thing about the importance of the work that we need to continue to do on domestic violence and the importance of looking at it from both a public safety and a public health lens. Several years ago, we were looking at the most violent offenders within our city, the percentage of young men who were either involved in homicides or shootings. And we were thinking, well, okay, we're going to target these individuals based on their histories and the information that we have. But it was a public health person within the city of Minneapolis who says, Rondo, you need to look at it a little bit different. And when we scrolled back and saw these 23 and 24-year-olds with their first entry into our engagement with them, they were children who witnessed family violence. Overwhelmingly, all of them did. And when we thought we were going to the call, and when the victim was there and the perpetrator was gone, and we were making our report and giving them that case number, and leaving when they had a 3- and 4-year-old who had witnessed that traumatic incident along with the victim, we thought we were doing our job. What we failed to do was to provide those services and follow-ups with those children because that stayed with them. And so we are continuing to do some great work and good work in that, but I also think we have to continue to look at it from a public health lens as well.
So, not letting you off the metaphysical hook, we have a big question that is couched in a very specific factual situation. My uncle illegally immigrated to the United States from Mexico as a child. He was deported and came back legally. Now he's a naturalized citizen. It wasn't easy, but it was fair. Why is this now considered inhumane? And it's addressed to the panel.
Start. Which part is considered inhumane? The fact
Maybe
that
being deported in the first place.
Oh, the deportation. Right. Well, it's obviously considered inhumane, I would say, in my opinion, because of the,
Since you're getting the son, I'm going to give you your gift ahead of time.
Oh, thanks. Thank you. Well, I feel like, every deportation is always inhumane unless a person has committed a very serious crime. Person mentioned that it was his or her uncle, and obviously part of a family. In my opinion, every time a family is torn apart for a non-serious crime, that's inhumane.
I agree.
All right. Well, Mayor Fry, you've identified extended jail time and custody pretrial in county jail as events that now trigger deportation proceedings for undocumented individuals. Bail is an enormous barrier for low-income communities and often is set without regard for an individual's ability to pay. Will you commit to working with county agencies to reevaluate bail and its collateral consequences on low-income immigrants in Minneapolis?
Absolutely.
Okay, I'll just hand you the question.
Okay.
All right. Chief Arredondo, your comments about how the Hennepin County Sheriff's Office imply that ICE is being notified as a matter of policy by the Sheriff's Office. Is that the case?
And I've had conversations with Sheriff Stanek. There's a process that they undergo in terms of that notification process as someone is being detained in the jail. And the question was, is that being implied, or is that the
is it actually the process?
There is a process that allows for notification for ICE staff of those individuals who perhaps from the foreign-born booking sheets that are in custody. Yeah.
All right. So, Mayor Fry, you mentioned pro bono services, pro bono legal services. Will you be taking volunteers? How is that going to pan out? Do you have any more of the details about that, that program?
So there are, I believe, 2 different entities that we work with presently on pro bono legal services. One of them is Legal Aid, and then the other one is, I don't remember the name of the other one. But so there's 2 organizations that the city works with directly. And I would strongly encourage attorneys to get involved as well. As a young attorney, when I first started practicing, not only was it the right thing to do and fulfilling to work in some of these pro bono cases, whether it was in the form of immigration law or housing court, but you also got quick experience too. I had my very first trials that I underwent in housing court. I worked with individuals who were experiencing immigration issues, notwithstanding the fact that that was really not my particular area of expertise. And what you find at the end of the day is a whole lot of it has very little to do with the law, and it's more to do with problem solving. Working with an employer who has withheld pay and involved in wage theft, otherwise known as stealing. Working with individuals who were in the process of trying to figure out how to expunge a record. These are things that aren't necessarily legal, have legal components, but are more problem solving, and I think the city can and should be devoting time and energy to those areas.
All right. So here is one for the panel. We're rapidly running out of time. The immigration issue is framed often around black and brown bodies. When are we going to address European and Asian immigrant issues?
I will just say that certainly my experience, there's been more vocal concern with more of our black and brown community members, but my policies are going to be shaped to continue to make sure that we are treating all of our community members in a manner that provides for that public safety and dignity and respect. So if that becomes, when I hear about those things, and if there are, again, spaces that we are either the most appropriate or we need to have other individuals react and help to navigate those situations in our Southeast Asian or European communities, I'll be at the table for that as well.
Yeah. If I understand the question correctly, I think what it's calling out is the juxtaposition between treatment of black and brown immigrants and the treatment of white immigrants from European descent. Pretty much all of us are immigrants at one point or another through our heritage. My family is Ukrainian Jewish, and our story of coming here is that they were in a shtetl, in kind of a ghetto in then Russia, and that my great-great-grandparents, they fell in love with one another, and the families didn't like each other very much, so they forbid them from rendezvousing in secret. But they nonetheless continued to hang out together, and one day they decided to get a photograph taken. So they went to the photographer's shop to get the photograph taken, and as the story goes, they were so good looking that the photographer took the photo and put it up on the window for the whole town to see. I actually have the photograph, and they're not really that good looking at all. But both families disowned them. They then moved to Paris, and then eventually migrated to the United States in New York City, and started their lives there. And then many years later, they went back to try and figure out, what became of their families, and every one of them dead in the pogroms or in the Holocaust. And I mean, this is not a unique story in that we always have relied on an immigrant population. The only difference is that at the time, when they were allowing large amounts, and when we had continued to allow large amounts of immigrants into the country, they were predominantly white or close to light skin. And now that's not always the case, and let's call it what it is. That's racism, and that's something that we need to change.
So Felipe, we are over time, but I'm going to give you a minute because you're
well, I guess what I wanted to point out is that as we're talking about black and brown immigrants, we are a far younger community. You know, we're obviously we've been here for the border crossed us. You know, border crossed into Mexico many years ago, but we're more of a newer immigrant generation, which is why, you know, a lot of issues affecting a lot of the immigration narrative is based or focused on us. However, as SEIU, we do have an interracial and intercultural, interethnic immigration coalition that we're a part of, where we're addressing. You know, we have an API table, we have a West African table. We don't have a European table, but that's because, you know, at this moment, it seems like the immigration system is more inaccessible to black and brown folks than non. That's what it seems like. But we do have a coalition that is representing and trying to be as inclusive as we can, and we're working on federal and state issues that affect immigrants.
Well, we could go on the rest of the afternoon, but we are out of time, and classes start for some people in 2 minutes. So we're going to wrap up. Thank you all very much for joining us today, and if the audience could give their thanks as well. Thank you very much.